All right, I think this is on. I noticed that most people went to home at a reasonable time last night, so it's nice to see the room full at 9 a.m. Not as many speakers, though. They were badly behaved last night, many of them. Not me. I stayed till midnight. I had my whiskey, and then I went to bed. So I'd be bright and fresh for all of you. Not that I'm in this time zone. I'm not even close to this time zone. I'm from British Columbia. And my usual way to introduce you to British Columbia is to show you the wildlife camera. So my house is on the left, my neighbor's house is on the right. Behind us is only forest. This is a Wednesday morning, and Wednesday mornings in my neighborhood is garbage day. And so these guys come and check to see if I put out my garbage early. Now, in this part, it is actually, I get fined if I do, but more importantly, it gets distributed evenly all over my yard if I do. Although this particular bear is a good bear, because if you put your garbage out early, he tends to simply tip the can, grab a bag, and take it back into the forest with you. So basically, the bear takes your garbage out for you, which that's a pretty good bear. And because Jimmy Engstrom is around, I figured I'd at least throw one more clip up. So this is my front door cam, and we get the other camera is just around the corner here, looking back. There's a little beggar. So and literally he looks in the window too, right? He's like, "Hey, any food? Just checking." In our part of the world, we call them trash pandas. Lots of those around. I make a lot of podcasts. Any .NET Rocks listeners? Awesome. Well, thanks. In a lot of ways, the history of .NET for me has been a history of making the show. So along the way, for this hour, at least I'll tell you a few times where this is what we were doing at the time as well. And I make a few different shows. Carl started .NET Rocks back in 2002 before the word podcast even existed. Today we published episode 1832, which is the price for doing a weekly for 20 years. I do have some IT chops, and so I've been talking about IT-related stuff on Run As Radio every Wednesday since 2007. And for a brief interval, and we'll talk about this because it's relevant to the history, we made a show called The Tablet Show for about 3 years. And then we decided we could roll it back into .NET Rocks, so we didn't have a separate show. But if we're going to talk about the history of .NET, we kind of got to talk about the history of Microsoft. And we're going to do it through the Microsoft logos, beginning with the original, the 1970s Bee Gees disco logo of Microsoft, right? This is 1975 when Bill Gates quits Harvard and goes down with Paul Allen to New Mexico, to Albuquerque, to write a version of BASIC for this thing, for the Altair 8800, the original personal computer. This is so old it doesn't even have ROM. So when you wanted to boot this machine, you actually loaded instructions from those switches. The boot sequence was 114 bytes. So for 114 times in a row, you had to set the switches and load the accumulator to get it to a bootloader enough to be able to run something on it. And in this case, that could be a version of BASIC. So this is from the Computer Museum in San Jose. This is actually donated by Bill himself. That's his handwriting. This is not the original BASIC. This is the 8K version, the upgraded version of BASIC, version 2. If there's any insight you can get from Microsoft, if you really talk about the fundamentals of it, it's that Bill realized that software was going to be the more important part, right? He was making software for microcomputers, Microsoft. Because up until that point, the hardware came with software, and you bought a piece of equipment and you wrote your own software. And then at that time, iterating very rapidly, starting in the 70s, there were new machines all the time, and you were basically starting over every time. And so Bill's recognition was, as long as we're starting over with each new piece of hardware, we're never going to improve. What I need to do is build a set of tools and resources that will work across different PCs. So as a new PC comes along, you can carry that code forward. That meant charging for software, which really hadn't been done before. And arguably, what Bill Gates will be remembered for 1,000 years from now is the end user license agreement. Because that's what he had to produce. And his father was a lawyer. Like, that's where that stuff came from, this idea that we're going to charge for software, so there's liability to that software, so let's protect ourselves from liability to that software. And if you ever read a ULN, I do not recommend that, you'll find out it says you don't own the software. You own a license to use the software, and that license limits the liability of the creator of the software to the value of the software. So if you spent $300 on a piece of software like Multiplan and used it to design a bridge, and the calculations for Multiplan were incorrect and your bridge fell down, here's your $300 back. That's a EULA. But the reason for that was that they wanted to be able to build up a body of software. They wanted to create this industry. This vision of a PC on every desktop was part of that. So we go from the 70s Microsoft to the 80s Microsoft, the metal Microsoft, right? And that's when Microsoft changes. They had started out purely as a tools and development company, but in the 80s, they started making an operating system. This is an apocryphal story, although it's true, of IBM, because of a legal consent decree with the US government, had to outsource as much as possible when developing for peripheral products, and they were starting to make a PC. Their real business was mainframes, and so they were, to comply with the Department of Justice consent decree of 1972, they outsourced the operating system, and they outsourced it to Microsoft, and Microsoft licensed it to IBM, and then also retained a license for themselves. And that began this business of making operating systems alongside development tools. And so then we get to the 90s, somewhat aerodynamic Microsoft, and the beginning really of our story in development tools. So by the late 90s, Microsoft has Windows and a host of different development tools, all with their own IDEs. And they realize this is inefficient, we need to bundle them together. And so in 1997, they made the first version of Visual Studio. And in the box was Visual Basic 5, the original being from 1991, but now we're up to version 5. Fox Pro, which they had bought, and they called that version 5 as well. A version of Java, their second version, which they called 1.1. And then Visual InterDev, which was their first attempt to build web tools. Actually, their second attempt. The first attempt was Front Page. This is the second attempt. This was InterDev. And then C++, plus source control, and a bunch of other tools. Now, this is not an integrated product. In fact, the IDE for C++ and VB and FoxPro are all separate IDEs. When you buy the box and you install it, you're actually installing multiple IDEs. The only shared IDE is the one built by Anders Hallsberg for J++, and also InterDev ran within it. That's the only two tools that use the shared IDE. And a year or so later, we get the second version of Visual Studio called 6, because numbers are hard. The previous version being called 97. And inside of 6 is everything renumbered 6. So it's VB6, it's C++ 6, it's FoxPro 6, it's J++ 6, which is actually the third version of J++, which should have been called 2 because they previously had 1.1, but numbers are hard. And the second version of InterDev, also called 6, and going to be the last version of InterDev because nothing good is happening there. So these are the original Visual Studios. Still nothing to do with .NET, not yet, but we're getting closer. Now let's talk about Microsoft in the late 90s. And I like to show this picture because it's such a happy picture. And this is Bill and Steve, and it's 1998, and they feel pretty good about things. You know, they're kind of on top of the world. They've got Windows 98 is out. They still think that's a good idea. ME hasn't appeared yet, so they don't have that pain. They've got the separate NT line. They're starting to talk about how that'll integrate together, but it's not there yet. So it's a happy time. And in fact, a couple of years before, there was a Time magazine cover with Bill on it that was talking about him being a master of the universe, right? Good times. But shortly after this photo, we have this set of videos. This is the deposition of Bill Gates by the US Senate talking about anti-competitive practices. You can watch these videos. They're on YouTube. I guarantee you Mark Zuckerberg has watched every single one of them because this is a demonstration of what not to do at a Senate hearing because Bill is rude. Admittedly, politicians are not that sharp, and trying to explain technology to them is kind of a dumb waste of time. But don't let them know you think that. That's a bad idea. And that's what he did. And it was part and parcel of what ultimately became the Department of Justice order to declare Microsoft a pernicious monopoly and that the company should be broken up. That was at the end of '99. And the Time magazine cover changed. So we go from master of the universe to busting Bill in 4 years, right? Now, this is a very American thing, right? You build up the hero, then you tear it back down again. None of it is reasonable, but it is what happened. So November of 99, Microsoft has declared a pernicious monopoly and ordered to break up into an operating system company and an everything else company. Now, we know that didn't happen. Shortly after November 99, in January of 2000, same pair of guys don't look quite as happy anymore, but this is the announcement of Bill stepping down as CEO and Steve taking over. So Bill recognized that he was now an impediment to keeping the company together. He had been part of the entire DOJ process, and it hadn't gone well, and now they're being ordered to break up. And so he steps down to become chief architect, and Steve steps up as CEO, which was a transition they were already planning. It just got accelerated. But Steve's first mission is keep the company together, right? Come up with a deal, which he'll succeed in doing. It'll take him almost 2 years. He'll get his consent decree by November of 2001. It's January 2000. And I explain all of that to set a stage for what .NET appeared in, because .NET was not an intentional product. .NET was a set of problems that existed inside of the organization that eventually ran into each other. And I'm going to break it into 3 areas. I'm going to put a face on each of those areas. But I want you to understand there are hundreds of people behind each of those faces. Okay? Let's start at the beginning with the first problem. And I'm putting Brian Harry in front of this. Now, Brian joined Microsoft in an acquisition for what would become Visual SourceSafe. He lived and worked in North Carolina. He and his brother had been building a source control system with a GUI on it, one of the very first ones. Up to this, then source control had all been text-based. This is in the 90s. Microsoft acquired them. They built the GUI on top of it. We now know it as Visual SourceSafe. And if you ever did any work back in that day, Visual SourceSafe, we did things with it was never intended to do, and so it really got pressed. We pushed it in directions that was very hard to do. And when he joined Microsoft, he transitioned off of Visual SourceSafe within a year, and he got a new project. And the project was the common runtime. Now, the runtime problem had nothing to do with development tools per se at the time. Really, it was a problem that Windows had. So Microsoft made all of these different development tools, but their primary business is Windows. And so each time they put out a new version of Windows, they have new capabilities in Windows, and they have to wait for dev tools to implement ways to access those new Windows capabilities in each of their runtimes. And that basically gives each team sort of a say on how those Windows features appear and when. And so the Fox guys would do one thing, and the VB guys would do another thing, and the C++ guys would do another thing. And this was frustrating for Windows. And so they said, could we have a common runtime, please? That we could build a runtime that any of these languages could utilize. We don't have to have separate ones. It was a hard problem, and it wasn't going anywhere for a long time. But that was an initial mechanism was, well, I want a common runtime for surfacing features in Windows. And Brian would own will become the CLR for 1 and 1.1. Next up, our friend Anders Hallsberg. Anders Hallsberg built Turbo Pascal back in the day with Borland, and then Delphi, built an object-oriented version of Pascal, and then he got recruited by Bill Gates into Microsoft to work on Java tooling. So he worked on J++ and the common version of Visual Studio, until Sun Microsystems decided they didn't want Microsoft to be playing with Java anymore. Now, that's a long, complicated story all on its own, involving folks like Brad Silverberg and so forth, going back into the 1990s again. The story goes that when Sun and Microsoft signed the agreement about how to utilize Java, both companies were in breach of the contract as they signed it, and it got worse from there. But ultimately, Microsoft being dominant in the microcomputer space with Windows in the late 90s, they were very heavily working on optimizing Java for Windows for obvious reasons. And Sun ultimately pushed back on that and got a cease and desist order that required Microsoft to get rid of all versions of Java from the company entirely. The JVM, any implementations, all of it had to be purged. A team would then go on as .NET started to emerge to make a version of Java called J#, that actually used the common runtime to allow J++ projects to migrate onto .NET. And they'd sustain that for about 6-7 years. So, and as Java got pushed out of the company, Anders didn't have a job, and they're like, what do you want to do? And he says, well, you need an object-oriented enterprise language. Let me make one for you, which was an unusual thing because Microsoft did not make languages. They implemented existing languages, which is what they intended to do with Java, except that Java was a much more commercial language than, say, BASIC or C++. And so they got into trouble there, so now they were going to make their own. Initially, he called it a C-like object-oriented language, or COOL. It was a good name. And if you saw the early builds of .NET, we had these cool namespaces, but eventually they would change it to C# because it turns out you can't copyright COOL. Finally, certainly not least, but last, our friend Scott Guthrie. Scott Guthrie was a summa cum laude out of Duke University in computer science, and he interned at Microsoft in his 4th year and was basically told, go finish your degree, and when you get back, you can have any job you want. And he thought he'd join Windows, and he was discouraged from doing that. It was a guy named J.L. Lard, one of the guys principal behind the Xbox, who said to him, hey, don't go where we've already had success. Go where we need success. And pushed him to do something webby. Like, we really need a better solution to the web because front page ain't cutting it. And neither is interdev. And so, as a result, Scott took his advice and joined the NT Option Pack team, which doesn't sound very sexy, but NT Option Pack is where IIS lived. And so that's what he was ultimately going to work on. In fact, there's a fun sort of apocryphal story of our very young Scott in his mid-20s has just joined Microsoft. He got in the fall of '97. So this is Studio 97's already shipped. They're working on Studio 6. And so he's contributed to that team for a few months, and they ship in November of '97. And then it's normal, once you get a product out the door like that, you take a couple of weeks off. Well, that was the first 2 weeks of December. And so in the last 2 weeks of December, nobody wears anything anyway. So for the most part, the studio team was off all of December. But our young Mr. Guthrie, who's only worked for the company a few months, is like, I don't want to go home. I think he took like a day off and went skiing on Christmas Day. But other than that, he just worked right through December on his own. And he was trying to come up with an implementation of, what could we do for better web development? And he had this idea that we've used an object-oriented scripting language against ISAPI filters. And so he prototyped most of it through December, and in January, whenever he was back at work, he showed off this, hey, look, we can script with an object-oriented language against ISAPI filters. The scripting language he chose was Java, because that's what Microsoft had at the time. And it was compelling. People were pretty excited about it. They said, okay, well, we really like what you've done so far. You just can't use Java. But that was the kernel of what would eventually become ASP.NET. Although, again, at this point, with these initial pieces, we haven't got a name. We're not doing any of that yet. These are disparate problems that were all emerging, and they eventually run into each other. Anders was implementing C# directly against Windows. He would find out about the runtime problem later and then work against the runtime. In fact, there was even a debate as to whether or not they would do a garbage-collected implementation, or should they do reference-counted implementations. There was a bake-off to which was going to be faster, where garbage collected or reference counted, and the garbage collectors won. I mean, the saving grace for Microsoft is they had written their own JVM, so there was a group of folks there that knew garbage collection very well and knew managed memory models. They'd all been the Java infrastructure developers for Microsoft, guys like Patrick Dassault. And so they worked out, when the CLR problem came forward, they said, well, we can make a managed runtime there, and we know how to do that, and they actually wrote a very good one. So, slight fast forward, we're now at 2000. This is actually a copy of the PDC graphic from 2000. You'll notice it looks really good, and that's because I had this made. The original version of this from 2000 is 320 by 200. It was 2000, right? You didn't have big graphics. You were still on dial-up, for crying out loud. So when I was putting the story together, I actually got a bunch of the old graphics of the different conferences and things, and then handed them to a designer and said, make me 1080p's of these. So I have the only high-resolution version of PDC 2000, and you can't have it. This was a funny PDC. It kind of came out of nowhere. All of the stuff I just described to you was entirely internal. But so from the outside world, in 2000, what were we thinking about? Well, Bill Gates had just stepped down as CEO 6 months before. The company had been ordered to break up. What was that going to mean? I mean, that's what we knew. We didn't know much else. And we were waiting for another version of Visual Basic, right? VB6 had come out in 98. We had a service pack in 99. Now it's 2000. Our expected announcements that the PDC was Service Pack 2 for Visual Basic 6, maybe a VB7. Nobody was expecting .NET. The name existed then. They called it a new platform based on internet standards. So think about this from Steve Ballmer's position. His first, most important mission is to keep the company together. And so he's talking to the U.S. Department of Justice about how Microsoft's going to be a more open company now. And so in these announcements, he says, hey, we're building a whole new dev stack. We're going to call it .NET, and it's based on open internet standards. In fact, we are going to publish ECMA specifications for both C# and the runtime for anybody to use. All parts of their gestures to show we're a more open company now. You don't need to break us up. For the most part, we're completely blindsided and surprised. Like, what? A new dev stack? Were you going to tell us? It's miles away from being ready, but it's definitely in the works. In that same time period, we get Windows 2000. This is the unification Windows. This is the one where they take the NT line and the 9X line and merge them together into one common version. This is when Windows NT stopped supporting multiple processors. Up until now, you could get a version of NT not only for the Intel chipset, but also for Alpha, MIPS, and PowerPC. By 2000, you're like, it's going to be Intel. This is also the first version of Windows that defaults to TCP/IP, because it turns out they were pretty sure this internet was going to be a thing. Up until that, the default was NetBEUI, and you actually had to install TCP/IP separately. Before that, this is also the first versions of the Pentium 4 and gigahertz processors. So this is the world that .NET's being born into. That next year in 2001, a very young Miguel Diaz-Casa, who's working for a company called Simian, trying to build an IDE for Linux called GNOME, has read those ECMA specifications and thinks C#'s a pretty nice language. They've been doing an awful lot of work in scripting languages like Python and Scheme and things, and they were trying to get more performance for GNOME. And so he wanted a language that was object-oriented and expressive, but had the opportunity to compile well and be fast. And so he's excited about the possibilities of what C# represents. Now, again, this is literally Microsoft in a very dark time, having been declared a pernicious monopoly. So the Linux folks are not big fans. And here's this very popular Linux personality saying, hey, what Microsoft's building here is pretty cool. I'd like to do an implementation in Linux. And he would form a group they would later call Mono. And it would take them a couple of years to get through that. Most part, the specs were not sufficient. So even though they had the specifications, they didn't have file formats, they didn't have a bunch of the base class libraries, like they were missing a lot of key things. They started white room reverse engineering a bunch of it to try and figure it out, but it would take years to really make progress on that. I mean, Microsoft wasn't really trying to encourage other people to implement their language. They were just publishing specifications and hoping that would keep people calm. But Miguel was actually trying to do it. And by the fall of 2001, at the next PDC in Los Angeles, we get the first sets of release candidates. This is also when we get IE6. We actually got it ahead of Windows XP. And by the end of, this is also when Microsoft announced Hailstorm or My Services, which you think about it today, they were very prescient, right? This was the idea of, hey, rather than you have a separate username and password for every website or every application you're using, why don't we do that for you? We'll give you My Passport. And you just log into us, and then we'll provide you access to all those things. Us, the pernicious monopoly. It was, from a timing perspective, a little on the nose, right? So, needless to say, My Services and Hailstorm and so forth didn't go anywhere at the time, but, you know, they were trying. And we got our Windows XP. Now, not the XP that we know and love. The original version of Windows XP was pretty primitive, right? The know and love version of XP will be Service Pack 2. It doesn't even support USB at this point. It's 2001, right? It's all pretty raw. This is also the real security crisis. I mean, 2001 is when the Anacornicova virus comes out, Code Red Worm 2, NIMDA. I mean, all in the same year. to the point where by January of 2002, Gates puts out an internal letter called Trustworthy Computing, which really says we need to fix the security stuff. And that's what kicks off Service Pack 2 of XP. Within a year of XP shipping, XP shipped in November of 2001. By January of 2002, Bill's already saying, we've got security problems, we need to deal with this. Now, Service Pack 1 of XP was already spec'd out. It was all the stuff that didn't make the initial ship. So now they put together a team for Service Pack 2. And it was an important decision to make it a service pack rather than make it another version of XP. We'd been told all along that from an operating system perspective, when we make breaking changes, it should be a new OS. But they wanted everybody to install these security fixes, so they were going to make it a service pack so that it was free and that everybody would install it. And that would cause them problems later on. But at this time, they're already aware of the problem. They pull a whole bunch of the senior people out of the Windows team to work on this service pack and to rejigger security for Windows. And that actually delays the shipping of .NET for almost a year as they do security passes on everything related to .NET. A lot of stuff that came out of code access security was from that security pass. But by February of 2002, we get the very first version of .NET bundled with Studio. We call it Studio.NET, like there was going to be another kind of Studio, but there wasn't. That never really came to pass. We get our first version of C#, this object-oriented type-safe language. We get the J# path to move the J++ folks over to .NET. FoxPro leaves the box and becomes its own product. We do have a unified IDE. And we have the pitch for Microsoft at that time was 22 languages, one platform. It was the corollary to what Java was saying, which was any platform, one language. Right? Those early days of Java, you'd program in Java and it could run on everything. And here was Microsoft saying, hey, it's only for Windows, but we have 22 languages you can use in the box for V1. Can anybody name 22 languages? So I found the list. Took a while. Here they are. Obviously, so they started to break into three groups. There's the group made by Microsoft, so C#, C++, VB, J#, JScript, and so forth. Then there's a group of academic implementations, so your Mercury, Oberon, Haskell, Eiffel, and then there was a group that were industry, COBOL, Fortran, Smalltalk. Some of these still exist. You can go to Visual Studio Marketplace today and download a version of Fortran, Fortran.NET, maintained by IBM. There's a version of COBOL.NET maintained by Fujitsu. So if you want, like, there's still other languages out there to this day. Most of these did not get out of V1. Within a year, so February 2002, we have the first version. April of 2003, we get 1.1. So this is the bug fix revision. It's the second edition, but they call it 1.1. And we're dealing with a bunch of problems that they knew was already there. It's still pretty rough, these early versions of .NET. We have web forms development. We have VB.NET, which has got as much in common with VB as, well, actually, I think anything in common with VB except the name. And so VB developers are pretty frustrated. Their cheese has been moved. From my experience as a VB developer, I found it easier to write C# because at least I wasn't trying to fool myself that it was VB. And the documentation was mostly in C# as well. This is the first version they make where they start making different editions. So they have an Architect's edition. They're trying to sell more expensive SKUs for enterprise. And so by later in 2003, we get to PDC, another remade graphic. And Microsoft, being the more open company, is starting to show what they're working on way in advance. And what they're working on is the next version of Windows. So the XP2 team is still doing its thing, but now Microsoft having the dominant operating system, XP is 90+% of OSs. They're like, we can reinvent the operating system. And they had started right in 2001 with a concept. Well, there are code names, right? So the code name for XP was Whistler. And Whistler is actually a ski mountain not far from where I live. It's about a 4-hour drive in Whistler Village. And there's actually two ski mountains right side by side. One's called Whistler, the other one's called Blackcomb. So the code name for the next version of Windows after Whistler was Blackcomb. And it was supposed to be an object-oriented operating system. So you understand that Bill had just stepped down as CEO. And he was chief architect. And he clearly had too much time on his hands. So he was busy, he really wanted to reinvent OSs. He wanted to go all objects, he had his sort of grand vision, and the Blackcomb vision was so large that even Microsoft's like, okay, we can't build that. So they dialed it back. Now, if you ever get a chance to go Whistler Village, you'll find out that between the Whistler Mountain and Blackcomb Mountain is a really big bar called the Longhorn Bar. And so at the PDC in 03, we met Windows Longhorn. So Windows Longhorn was the dialed back version of the original object-oriented vision of the next generation operating system. And it had 4 pillars with great code names: Avalon, Indigo, Arrow, and WinFS. 3 great code names. Avalon was a new UX paradigm. Indigo was a new communications protocol. Arrow was the semi-transparent UX. And WinFS was an object-oriented file system. And things were beautiful. PDC 03, we were all excited. We had early bits. It was fun to play with. It was going to be a .NET development space. .NET was integrated in the operating system. We were all very excited. In 2004, we get XP Service Pack 2. This is the breaking change version of XP. This fixes a lot of key problems. But we're also up against it now. The challenge is this. It's been 4 years. The OS shipped in 2001. It's now 2004. And they're due for another operating system, and they're falling behind. In November of 2005, we get, I would argue, the original vision of .NET, what we always intended for .NET, the enterprise development tool. 2005 was very robust. This is version 2, although it's the 3rd version because numbers are hard. But they have fixed a lot of the bugs. This is very stable. It can now run reliably on a server. And there's a good reason for that. The SQL CLR came from 2005. So the SQL team had been asking for a more robust language they could run inside of the SQL context. And so they pushed the .NET team to make a version of it. The .NET team resisted for a long time, but as they got to understand how SQL Server was developed, it had an unbelievable suite of testing tools. And so by testing .NET inside of SQL Server, they were finding bugs in .NET that they had a tough time finding in Windows. And so the process of making SQL CLR work, which took several years, made this much more robust version of .NET. Taking the platform out of its usual context, running in a different context, made it much more robust. And so in 2, we get the 64-bit version, although they do it as compile any, which is a good choice as long as you always run as 32-bit. As soon as you run a 64-bit, it'll fail. And we would learn to stop doing that. We also get C# 2.0, which is when we start resurfacing generics, which have been in part of the type system from the very beginning, to do better than Java. They also dropped the .NET from the name. It's just Visual Studio. And so we have the product they'd always intended to build. It's taken them a few years, but we're there. It's an enterprise class product, runs well on the server. You can make web forms-based websites. And that's not where the market is now. It's 2005, coming into 2006, and web development is transformed. We have Ruby on Rails. We have the open web. And so Microsoft needs to respond to that. And they start by making a new conference called Mix. And again, another graphic I've remade. There are no high-resolution graphics from Mix 06 except this one. And Mix 06 is when they roll out IE 7. So they did IE 6 back in 2001. Where had they gone for 6 years? That was the team that was building Avalon. For the most part, the Internet Explorer team was dismantled, was focused on building what was Avalon, you now know as XAML. So same guys. And so when as they'd gotten the initial prototypes done that were now going into Longhorn, they refocused back on IE and fixed a bunch of things and made IE 7 and made it part of Mix. This is also where they announced that they were coming up with new web development tools, something they were going to call WPFE, but we hadn't even seen WPF yet. And so by November of 2006, we get Windows Vista. So what went wrong? It's interesting to note that it was 5 years to the month, right? XP shipped in November of 2001. Vista shipped in November of 2006. but only one edition of Vista shipped in 2006, the Enterprise Edition. If you're a large company and you were buying stuff from Microsoft, you had a volume license agreement. That volume license agreement is basically they count up the number of people who work for you, that's at a price per person, you get all the stuff. And inside the volume license agreement is a guarantee that you will get a new operating system every 5 years. They ran out of time. 5 years on the nose, they put out the Enterprise Edition with some serious bugs in it. Now, the good news was, if you're an enterprise IT guy, you weren't going to install this anyway. We'd learned long before that, you only install SP1s, right? Don't get the initial version. Wait for the first service pack. You'll clean up that stuff. Then you'll go look at it. So I think Microsoft was betting on the fact nobody would install this. But they were wrong. There was one group of people who installed this. Journalists. And it was bad. And they told everybody. And my mother told me, I don't want Vista on my computer. It's like, I don't think you're qualified for an opinion, but okay. It would get fixed. But one of the fallouts of Vista for .NET was that they kicked out the 4 pillars. They pushed out all the .NET related stuff. Avalon and Indigo and all left. So Avalon became Windows Presentation Foundation. Because if you have a good code name, you get a bad product name. Indigo became Windows Communications Foundation. And basically we had to make an emergency version of .NET. .NET 3 picked up the fallout from Longhorn so that it could become Vista. There was also workflow and card space were part of that. But still the CLR2, it was just we called it version 3. And the hits keep on coming because by the next year we get the phone. And this is a boring phone, really. You know, the original iPhone was not that cool. In fact, I would argue phones were more fun before the iPhone. Like in the old days, phones had cool little antennas and keyboards and slide-out thingies and so forth. But after the iPhone, everything's a slab of black glass. But it took a couple of versions, and it was transformative to the industry, right? For all the phones became the same, and full-scale development happened all out. Everybody needed a fart app, maybe more than one. And so, you know, we had a new industry that emerged that was not Windows-centric. And Microsoft was trying to diversify, be more cross-platform, and they had a new technology. They took Windows Presentation Foundation and said, we're going to make a special version of Windows Presentation Foundation called Windows Presentation Foundation Everywhere. But that's not the product name, that's the code name. Because if you have a crappy code name, you get a good product name. Silverlight. Good product name. Actually, Silverlight has another meaning. If you've never heard the phrase Silverlight before. Do you remember the old cameras with the rotary flashes? Right, you get 4 flashes from it. When you click, it go. It was a pile of magnesium wound in coils. And you burst some electricity to it, and burn it. And after that gives you a bright flash. And then there's little bits that are left behind. The bits left behind are called Silverlight because Silverlight is what comes after flash. Clever, huh? So in December of 2006, we get the first version of Silverlight. It has nothing to do with .NET whatsoever. The first version of Silverlight is JavaScript-centric. It's actually an engine for media playback for IIS. This is for Netflix. Netflix is trying to get away from shipping CDs in red envelopes. They want to start doing a streaming service, but the bandwidth's not reliable enough in 2006. And so they want to be able to vary rates based on the bandwidth that's available. And so they need a smart client that can communicate what bandwidth rates are and then be able to switch between file formats on the fly. Silverlight was the front end for that. IIS was the back end for that. So that was the first version. But the important part here was it always ran on the Mac, right from the get-go. They had a runtime that ran on the Mac. They had a runtime that ran on the PC. They were both plugins through the browser. But they allowed you to do these media playing. There would be better versions coming along after that. Also, in response to Ruby on Rails in the modern web development, Microsoft creates MVC. And they use MVC to start hiring more open source centric folks. On .NET Rocks, we started calling them Scott Guthrie's Ninja Army. Folks like Scott Hanselman and Phil Hack and Rob Connery, Glenn Block, all folks that had strong open source community positions and took it very seriously. And we're going to fight for open source inside of Microsoft as well as communicating it outside of Microsoft. Because the open source wave was hitting Microsoft in a big way. There was a group of folks that were very frustrated with Microsoft's approach to open source or lack of approach to open source. And we're far more focused on, and we're also frustrated with the community that largely only wanted to buy Microsoft products directly. There was good stuff that was happening on SourceForge and other repositories, and you should be taking some of that code out for a spin. When I first ran across them, and I talked about this on .NET Rocks, I called them the NHibernate Mafia. Because they were all NHibernate users, and this is just when Microsoft's starting on Entity Framework. They're like, why are you building another ORM? The world doesn't need another ORM. Help us fix Hibernate, which was a Java implementation for .NET, and Hibernate. And when I called them the NHibernate Mafia on the show, they freaked out, tried to come up with a better name, and their better name was alt.net, which is a pretty good name. It was only around for a few years, but their mission was very clear that Microsoft and Microsoft community should take open source more seriously, which, by the way, we do. We could argue their approaches, their approach to morality and arguments around these things. It was a little contentious, but it happened. The Ninja Army started making some books along the way, the first MVC books. This is a composite picture. This was actually on the cover of the book. That photo of Scott is literally the first photo taken for his badge at Microsoft in 1997. And this is a picture, this is a cover from 2007. So that photo is wrong. I'm pretty sure this is Scott's wedding photo edited. And yeah, and I think that's a high school graduation photo from Phil. So anyway, composite picture. But this is, MVC is their response to Ruby on Rails. It's a more testable, manageable version of web development. That none of the web forms people like it, but it does a good job. More importantly, with MVC, they start distributing it in an open source way. They create Codeplex. And Codeplex is a place for them to push code. You can't contribute to it, but you can download those early bits. You realize that up until that time, Microsoft would ship a version of Studio every 18 months or so, and that's the only time you'd see new bits. But with Silverlight and MVC, they started shipping out a band via Codeplex, so you could experiment with it and could give them feedback, and then you'd see that feedback within a month or so. You give them a good idea, they'd implement it and put it out in the next community rev, all through Codeplex. By 2007, we have the 2008 edition of Studio, and this is the version where they clean up the fallout from Longhorn. So this is version 3.5, so the CLR now has been revised. This is the end of J#. This is the beginning of Link, and us being able to express lambdas in C#. But also this idea that we're going to have designers working alongside of developers to implement WPF. So this is where expression blend comes from, but it was a sort of vision of, we have a broader design language in WPF that nobody understands, so we'll call that person who does understand it the designer. They wear a turtleneck, and they work on blend, and then that somehow integrates into Studio. And I made .NET Rock. I was making 3 .NET Rocks a week, and I'm trying to find those guys. I think I found 2. So great idea, just didn't actually happen. In the PDC of 08, we get the .NET version of Silverlight. So this is now where we have Silverlight 2 and 3 that they've integrated .NET 3 into. And we have the MVVM development model, so now we're coding in C# and XAML, and then being able to push it onto the Mac, which is kind of extraordinary, quietly. This is also the period where Microsoft starts sending money to the Mono team to build a Linux version of Silverlight they call Moonlight. And finally, we get to the PDC in 08, which is when this is where Silverlight 2 comes from, and we meet this guy, Ray Ozzie. So Bill's now stepped down as chief architect. He's now busy trying to cure polio and fight malaria. And good on him, because he did a lot. And Ray's now chief architect. And Ray writes good papers, but he has a tough time. He hasn't got the same gravity. But at the 08 is where he first starts talking about Azure. This idea that Microsoft has many large web properties that all run on unique stacks, and we need to unify them together. We're going to have a consolidated set of internet services. It was pretty early days. There's no bits to show yet. Vista gets cleaned up in a product we call Windows 7, still a beloved version of Windows. It's now 2009. And then things get really hairy. In early of 2010, in February, we get Windows Azure, the first version of Windows. And it runs, it has a database called SQL Azure, and then it has 3 programming platforms it understands: .NET, Java, and PHP. The next month, the big iPhone appears. So Jobs announces the giant iPhone, and the next month, we get Studio 2010. Now, Studio 2010, the definitive version of Studio. I worked heavily on this event. This is the version of Studio that implemented WPF as the client, the first internal Microsoft product to use WPF. Did a lot to improve it. We also get Silverlight 4, which supports Chrome and runs out of browser and is considered this is April of 2010. It's told like it's the definitive version. This is how you build enterprise apps. This is the way. This is also the version of Studio where they bundled jQuery, which is profound because that was an open source project that they initially, with MVC, they realized they needed a DOM tree navigator and they started writing their own. And the community said, "What are you doing? We have jQuery. Don't write another one." And they actually listened and agreed to bundle jQuery into the box, which means they provided tech support for jQuery. So, okay, we're not creating open source software yet, but we're now taking a version of open source software and including it in our own products. Almost the same time, Jobs puts out a letter called Thoughts on Flash. So Thoughts on Flash was really, hey, Flash murders the battery in the iPad. Now, he didn't say that. What he said is that Flash represented a serious security risk because plugins did represent a serious security risk. But it also murdered the battery in the iPad because Flash was never built for portable machines. It was built for desktops. It was not designed to be efficient, and by golly, it wasn't. And so when Jobs announces that all iOS devices, Safari on iOS is not going to allow plugins anymore, that kills Flash on iOS unless you go sideload your own browser, which the average mortal was not going to be able to do. But it also punches Silverlight right in the nats. Not that anybody says anything, because Microsoft sees the iPad as an existential threat to Windows. And so they are head down, what are we going to do about the iPad? And so we fast forward to the fall of 2010, the last PDC. It's on campus in Redmond. And amazingly, having only in April done a big launch event for Studio that was all about Silverlight at the Professional Developers Conference, there are no Silverlight sessions. None. Huh. And our friend Mary Jo Foley, at the time worked for ZDNet, asked Bob Muglia, who was head of server and tools, hey, why were there no Silverlight sessions at the PDC? And Bob said, our strategy has shifted. Now, I've subsequently asked Bob, like, did you know you were the first person to say anything about this at that time? And he didn't know. Because internally, they'd been talking nonstop about this. They just hadn't been communicating with the rest of the world about what the heck are we going to do about the fact that iOS just opted out. And their solution was Windows 8. That Windows 8 was going to fix everything. It was going to be a better tablet than the iPad. It was going to dominate the market. So we don't need to deal with Silverlight. We're going to replace it. They just didn't tell anybody, and they also didn't succeed. And to Mary Jo Foley, she published just what Bob Muglia said. Our strategy has shifted. It was all the other folks who said Silverlight is dead, and made a lot of people really angry. I mean, companies bet a lot on Silverlight at that time, and really had been given no guidance about what to do going forward. And I mean, for better or worse, they would now put one more version of Silverlight in December of 2011, the 5, which had the 64-bit implementation and GUI and GPU support, and then it would have 10 years support after that. So Silverlight went out of support in 2021, but that didn't change the scar that it put on an awful lot of people. That in the 6-month period, it became the definitive tool to our strategy has shifted. Anders Hallsberg at that point leaves the C# team on top of everything else, right? It was a grim time for all of us. We're like, what? Anders is doing what? He would eventually make TypeScript, but we didn't know that at the time. But this is also the era of HTML5. This is the duel between Google and Microsoft over HTML5 standards, right? And make sure we include Firefox in there too, because what they were doing was also important. And they, in a period of about 18 months, made JavaScript performance rocket through the roof. I'm looking at what's happening like literally this week with Bing AI and Bard. It's almost the same kind of duel. Two tech giants saying, let's innovate on technology fast and compete against each other. It reminds me of this era of 2011. The same thing where they constantly were putting out new builds, new optimizations. the GPU utilization, canvas, like pre-compilation, all of these optimizations that really made Node become what it could be. I mean, Node had been around for a couple of years at that point, but what happened in Chakra and V8 in the Java runtimes is what really enabled us to start thinking about JavaScript outside of the browser. And so we get to 2011 with the first build. Carl and I were there. So now PDC is gone. This is the first new developers conference. It's build, and it's all about Windows 8 and WinJS. There's no .NET content. They have this vision that this next version of Windows is going to be tablet friendly, but it's going to be programmable by anybody. And so the lingua franca is JavaScript. And so we need to have JavaScript programmers able to program Windows, hence WinJS. And the JavaScript programmers looked at what they wanted them to do and said, yeah, I'm not doing that. But it was the pre-announcement. And Carl and I walked out of this show, this is September of 2011, and said, hey, what if .NET doesn't rock? Because we make a show called .NET Rocks. So we made another show. We made the tablet show. By November, we had the tablet show up and running. Now, I had already had a problem as the content planner trying to figure out where do I put tablet content, because it's not really .NET at all. And so, okay, well, this is a place where that will live, but it's also, here's our contingency plan, because things are looking dark for .NET. If this is really the direction they're going to go in, we've got to do something else. So we lit up the tablet show and started cranking them out every week, and lots of great conversations. Now, you can't blame Microsoft for being very focused on defending Windows. If I pulled the annual report for 2011 and looked at all of the big businesses inside of Windows. So there were 12 lines of business inside of Microsoft in 2011 that grossed over $1 billion. 9 of them are Windows-centric. The 3 that aren't are Xbox, which was in the middle of the red ring of death. So even though it was grossing more than $1 billion, they were spending $4 billion trying to clean that up. Bing, which also grossed more than $1 billion while spending $2 billion. And Skype, which they had just bought for $8 billion. So yeah, a little Windows-centric. Okay. And at the same time, we have a somewhat older Miguel Diaz-Casa forming a brand new company. So Novell got bought by Attachmate, and Attachmate said, hey, this mono thing makes no money, lay all your people off. And so Miguel called his friend Nat Friedman, who'd helped set up Simian in the first place, and said, we need to make a new entity. And then ultimately was able to buy all of the mono assets from Attachmate, and the new company is called Xamarin. Now, he had, at that time, for the past couple of years been working with the Unity folks on being able to use C# to build iOS apps. And so he had Mono Touch already up and running. And by 2011, he had it working for Android as well. And I said at the time on the show, hey, I think the protector of C# is actually Miguel Diaz-Casa, and he's a Linux guy. What's up with that? But we know what happened from there. We get a new logo from Microsoft in 2012. It's been 25 years. It has nice colors. We also have had the swing towards open source. Microsoft announces this thing called MS OpenTech. This is an organization that on the surface is primarily making sure that important open source libraries work well with .NET and other tools, but internally is also where they're doing open source development themselves. And in 2012, we get the version of Studio aimed at Windows 8. Most people remember Studio 2012 as the one with the all caps menus that made everybody angry. But really, it was about trying to do development for Win 8, and so it had a lot of WinJS support. And we finally get, in the second build, the shipment of Win 8. And you can see I did not up-res this one. That's why the text is so lousy. So that's JS1. And, of course, the interesting part of the announcement for build was the fact the vast majority of Win 8 apps were written in C# and XAML. Whether you wanted, people weren't building WinJS apps. That wasn't the thing. So Win 8 was not exactly a hit, and by 2013, we see Win 8 being shuffled off to the side. Studio 2013 comes out. They get rid of the all-caps menus. But more importantly, Microsoft realizes that the center of the company is no longer Windows. The center of the company is Azure. And their best proof of that is when they rename Azure. So the pivot inside of the company was, with the failure of Win 8, was really this, hey, we've got to focus on the cloud. And so you stop tying that stuff to Windows. This is also when Satya becomes CEO. That's in February of 2014. April of 2014, the next build. This is when .NET Foundation is announced. And Roslyn ships and is open source and cross-platform. So we now have C# compiler as a service living in GitHub for anybody to use and implement anywhere. TypeScript ships. TypeScript was very important to Microsoft, even more important to us. There was a lot of people inside of Microsoft who fundamentally believed that Microsoft could not do well in the open source community. The open source community hated them so much, no matter what they did, it would fail. And then Anders, who's not an open source guy, put TypeScript out in the world, and the open source community embraced it. You know, what made TypeScript great was that all those type libraries for all the different tools would exist. And individual developers contributed those libraries en masse. The Eclipse folks built a plugin for TypeScript. Like, all of these products jumped on board. And so suddenly there was this talking point inside of Microsoft. It's like, hey, when we build the right thing, the open source community will embrace it. So it was a pivotal moment for Microsoft to understand that in 2014. Now, it wouldn't be till this is April of 2014, not till the fall of 2014, they would finally say, we're going to rewrite .NET. We recognize that open source and cross-platform is essential, but in order to do that, there's too much code inside of .NET. It's too bound to Windows. So we basically have to start over. It's a crazy thing to do, but they have a kernel of the beginning point, and it is Silverlight. The runtime for Silverlight was essentially a cross-platform version of the .NET CLR. That already had a version of C# working against it. So they dragged those bits up and rebuilt them, and it became .NET Core. Most of the code would ultimately be replaced, but it would be a progress. But more importantly, and part of the reason it took as long as it did, we're going to do everything through GitHub. So they start developing .NET entirely on GitHub from the outset. And they're learning how. It's a different way to work, and they're struggling with it. 2015, we get Studio. 2015, arguably the definitive version of Studio. This is also when they produce Visual Studio Code. And Visual Studio Code was that follow-on from TypeScript. Hey, if we build the right thing, the open source community will embrace us. Well, let's go build the best open source editor we possibly can build. That's Studio Code, and it's now the most popular editor on the planet. Not bad for a company that supposedly hates open source. And then by 2016, Xamarin becomes part of Microsoft. So our friend Miguel Diaz-Casa becomes distinguished engineer and still is working somewhat on Xamarin, although he gets pulled into some other projects as well. Nat Friedman goes over to the Studio team. He runs TFS for a while, and ultimately he'll be part of acquiring GitHub. .NET Core, of course, iterates rapidly. By 2016, we get the first version, version 1, the second version, 1.1, third version 2, because numbers are hard. And then by 2018, we're up to 2.1. And in 2018, we also have GitHub acquired in. So Microsoft's now the largest contributor into GitHub, and GitHub is still struggling to make money as a startup. Apparently, the other bidders were Google and Tencent, the Chinese company. So there were some folks that were pretty stressed about Microsoft owning GitHub, and some folks going, now we don't have to worry about it anymore. And you know, at the time, people were a bit more nervous. That's now 4.5 years ago. If it was going to be bad, it would have been bad by now, right? We're now on a steady cadence with .NET Core. I mean, 3.1 was an important version because that's when they started talking about doing platform-specific SDK. So that's when then WinForms for Core came along and some other stacks. And now it's every year. So they skipped 4 because they didn't want to confuse folks. They did 5 to try and convince everyone that you want to get off of 4.8. Now it's 5, then 6, then 7 every November. So this coming November, we'll get 8. And I've got a couple of minutes left to just talk a little bit about MAUI. So MAUI is their attempt as of 6 to try and unify the client development stacks. So this is starting with Xamarin Forms and then bringing the other elements in together. The most important part being WinUI, that they got WinUI out from the Windows team and part of this dev stack so that you can write a common set of code that are across all the platforms. And you saw us here yesterday talking to a couple of folks that work on that. It's still early days, but it's a powerful tool set. It just speaks to what do we want from client-side development that we're not getting from web development. What comes next? Well, to me, the biggest concern is somehow we have essentially had the same set of dev tools since 2002. So 21-year-old tool set. It's always been improved, but it's got a lot of baggage. You can write C# like it's 2004. I wouldn't recommend it, but you can. So one of the things I pressed on Mads Torgensen last time we talked, and I've got another show coming with him shortly, is like, how are you going to convince me to write C# 11 if I know C# 6 so well? It's like, well, that's a tooling problem. You notice I didn't say anything about artificial intelligence in this whole thing. Because from my position, artificial intelligence is what you call a technology when it doesn't work. As soon as it does work, it gets a new name. It becomes a vision system. It becomes a co-pilot. It becomes something else. So, but I do think we're going to see more machine learning models in our dev tools that are going to help us to write more optimal code given this access to this enormously long stack. When does .NET end? There seems to be no horizon on it anymore. It's now transcended Microsoft in a lot of respects. They don't make money directly off of it. It's an open source product that can be put almost anywhere. Lots of other folks are implementing against it. It's a pretty safe plot to live in. The question is, do you love the tooling or not? And we have several different ways to tool against this stack. You want to go all open source with Visual Studio Code and assemble your own tool set? Or are you happy inside the IDE where everything's provided for you? You have choices. I hope this helped you sort of get a picture on where .NET has come from and where it's going. Thanks so much for your time.